It's Bible Club, it's Bible Club, it's Bible Club in our town. There's singing, there's laughing, let's get the word on the ground. We're all excited, and we are all delighted. It's Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club, Bible Club in our town.
We have an important Bible word in our verse. I mean, there's God, there's the Lord, but there's a word beside God and the Lord that is in our verse that our lessons are going to be about. So who thinks they can tell what the word in our verse about God is, what our lessons are going to be about? Cody? Can you tell? Faithful, that's right. Is there any hints here? Did you catch it from the verse or from the sign there? From the lesson, yes. Our lessons are going to be about God's faithfulness. So our verse says, the Lord thy God, so Jehovah is another name there. The Lord thy God, he is God, and he is the faithful God. So we're going to learn about God's faithfulness for the next several weeks. Now, last week, we talked about how, who can tell me, who remembers what we talked about last week? Yeah, that's right. Somebody in particular. Oh, look at there. Abby. You know? What? Moses had to die. And why Moses had to die and he couldn't do what? Why? Why did Moses have to die and he was not allowed to go into the promised land? You remember? Kaylee, do you remember? Oh, that's right. You weren't here last week.
And I wasn't either.
Yes. So, Aaron, he sinned. That's right. He sinned, and we're gonna remember that again today. But I told you this last week. Moses was told that he had to die, and I told you about how he went up in the mountain and God buried him. But I also said that before he did that, before he went up in the mountain and died, he had about 1 month that he told the children of Israel some things, and what he told the children of Israel about was God's faithfulness. So, don't be confused, because I'm going to be telling you this week and next week and the next week and the next thing, the things that Moses told the children of Israel in that last month of his life. Okay? So we wanted to remember that God punished his sin by telling him that he had to die before he could go into the land of Israel. But this month, we're going to learn about God's faithfulness from the book of Deuteronomy. Now, the other thing we need to think about, try to start remembering, is the books of the Bible. What is the first book of the Bible? Aaron, what is the first book of the Bible? Allie? Genesis. And after Genesis, we have Genesis. Second book? What's the second book? Exodus. That's right. So, Genesis, Exodus, third book. Kaylee? Leviticus. Class? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. That's right. And now, our book for this month, these 4 weeks, is the 5th book of the Bible. And you remember saying it? Deuteronomy. So let's say the first 5 books of the Bible together. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And who did God use to write all 5 of those books of the Bible? The first 5 books of the Bible were written by the same man. God, it's God's word, but God used one man to write those books of the Bible. Who was it? See, everybody tell me the name that you're thinking of right now. So who was it?
Moses.
That was not everybody. Who did God use to write the first 5 books of Moses, of the Bible? Moses. That's right. So, sometimes the Bible talks about the books of Moses. So what are the books of Moses? Say them with me. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. the Ten Commandments? Aaron? And God's law. In Leviticus, we have some more of God's law. In Numbers, we have some more of God's law. And the book of Deuteronomy actually means second law, the second giving of the law. So, the first 5 books of the Bible are also called the books of the law. So, say with me the books of the law in order. Say the books of the law with me in order, class. Genesis, Exodus,
Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
Alright, so we've got the first 5 books of the Bible, and now we know those. And we're going to, pretty soon, before we know it, we're going to know the books of the Old Testament. We might even have to learn the old books of the Old Testament song. So, in our lesson today, Moses has the children of Israel, and has them all together, and he wants to tell them some things in this last month before he actually goes up on the mountain and dies, and remind them of some things. Today, we are going to learn some of the lessons of obedience. Lessons of obedience. Moses was there with the children of Israel, and now they were right across the river from the land that God had promised to them. How many remember some other names for the land that God promised them? It was the Promised Land, the Holy Land. We sometimes call it the Holy Land. Canaan, that's right. Sometimes they call it Palestine, the land of Israel. So they were right across the river from the land that God had promised them. And they had, well, how many of you have ever gone on a hike? How many of you have ever gone on a hike? Okay? How many of you have ever gone on a hike and it was a camping trip hike? You carried your tent with you and you went on a hike and then you set up your tent and then the next day you put your tent down and you hike farther. Have you ever done that? Have you done that? Probably none of you have hiked for as long as the children of Israel went on their camping hike. Right? Remember, Moses said to them, 40 years ago, we were slaves in the land of, fill in the blank, slaves in the land of Moses' planet, Egypt. Somebody's making noise there. Let's listen. If I can hear it in the wind, it's too much noise. They were slaves in the land of Egypt, and God said, it's time to come out of Egypt. And with a mighty hand and many marvelous, mighty works, God led the people of the children of Israel out of Egypt, and for 2 years they hiked and camped through the wilderness until they got to the land, to the land of Israel. Now, along the way, God told them the way He wanted them to live. Right? He gave them His law. He gave them the plan for the way their country would work. He gave them they taught them how they should build a tabernacle. Remember? And then they should bring their offerings and sacrifices. He gave them all of those things. And then He brought them to the edge of the land of Israel. And He said, okay, now you're ready. I want you to go into the land of Israel. Go into the promised land. And what did they say? What did they say? Anyone else? What did you say they said? No. They said no. Exactly. They said no. They said, first, let's send some people into the land. So God was patient with them, and He let them send some people in the land. How many people did they send into the land? Allie? 12. That's right. And 12 people went into the land, and how long were they in the land? Does anybody remember that? How long? 40 days. They were in the land for 40 days, and when they came back out, 10 of the men that went in, they were evil, wicked men, weren't they? They were bad, and they lied about the land because they were scared of the giants. So the people of the land, but Joshua and Caleb, the 2 good ones, they said, God has promised us this land. We can go in here. He will give us the land. But the people did not believe God. So the first thing they did, is that they disobeyed God. He said go in, and they said no. Then they were told that God would be with them, and they said we don't believe that. they did not believe God. So they rebelled against God, they disobeyed God, and they did not believe Him. And then God said to them, okay, then you won't go in the land. For 40 years you're going to wander in the wilderness. And then what did they say? Remember that? Anybody here? He said you're going to wander around the wilderness for 40 years. Stay calm. And they said, well, let's just go. We'll go in the land. And they decided, well, we'll go without God. And what happened then? They went in there, and the people of the land did fight against them and defeated them. So then, for 38 years, they had to wander through the wilderness. And as they wandered through the wilderness, all the people that had decided not to go in the land, they died, didn't they? They died, and that left the young people, the people that were 20 years old or younger, they got older, didn't they? Older and older, and now they are waiting across the river to go into the land of Israel. And Moses is reminding them. So the one thing that they learned is that when you disobey God, you are punished. God punishes those that disobey. They rebelled against Him. They did not believe in Him. Then they disobeyed Him because He said don't go, and they went. So they disobeyed. They got punished. And let's remember, God is a faithful God. Listen up. One of the things that the faithfulness of God means is that He's the same today as He was back then. Does God punish those that sin against Him today? He does. If we disobey, we're going to get punished. If we don't obey God, if we rebel against God, if we don't believe in God, or believe what God tells us, we will be punished. So, the children of Israel were reminded that when they disobeyed, they were defeated and they got punished. Then, listen up, girls. Moses reminded them about when they obeyed God. So they were there across the river, and they were just about time to go into the land, but God said, not yet. I want you to go this way. And when they went that way, a certain mighty king said, don't come through here. If you come through here, I'm going to fight against you. But they did what God wanted, and God allowed them to defeat in battle that mighty king. His name was Sihon the king, and his armies were defeated completely. They burned their cities, they captured their cattle, and they got the picture. They had more cattle because those people fought against them, and they did what God said. He gave them victory. Then another king, Og, I don't know how to say his name, but he was a giant of a man, and his people came to fight against Israel. The children of Israel obeyed God, and they were able to defeat Og and his armies. So they obeyed God, they did what He said, and they got victory in battle over their enemies. So, they were reminded, Moses reminded them, when they disobeyed, when they were rebellious, when they were full of unbelief, they got punished. And when they obeyed and did what God wanted them to, even though there were enemies, they won, and they got the victory. Finally, Moses reminded them about this. Who remembers this? We didn't have this picture before. We already talked about this today, right? There was that day when the children of Israel were thirsty. They were out of water. And they said, why are we here? And Moses went. What did Moses do? Whenever he had a problem, what did he do? He went to God and he prayed, and God said, take your rod, go to the rock, and what did He say to do to the rock? Hit it? What'd you say? Talk to it. That's right. He said, speak to the rock. And what did Moses do? He said, you bunch of rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock? And what did Moses do? He hit it. He hit it once. He hit it twice. And water came out of the rock. But God immediately told Moses, you disobeyed me. everybody would have known that that came from God. Now we know that the water came from God too, but Moses did what he wanted instead of what God wanted. And God was upset because Moses did not give him honor. So we should try to learn the lessons that Moses taught the children of Israel. Today, he reminded them about when they disobeyed, when they were rebellious, when they were unbelieving, and when they disobeyed, what happened? They got punished. And then when they did obey, even when there was enemies, what happened? God was with them. He protected them, and he gave them victory. And then even Moses, even the leader, when he dishonored God, God punished him also. And God is a faithful God. He's the same today as he was way back then. So we should learn. We should try to remember. What about us? Is there something that we know we should do that God teaches us in his word that we should do that we're like, I don't want to do that? Or God has promised that he will help us and we don't believe him. If there's something like that in our own lives, we should change our thinking, right? Because God is the same today. He's faithful. He will punish when we sin. He will protect and give us ability and power when we obey. And we should remember that, these lessons from the book of Deuteronomy. And next week, we're going to learn the next part of Deuteronomy, which is the second time that Moses gave the children of Israel the 10 Commandments. Maybe you could think through what those 10 Commandments are between now and next week. Some of them are easy to remember, some not as easy. But we're going to learn about the 10 Commandments next week at Bible.